So in part two of this week's topic, we're talking to David Ferrugia, who's been a colleague in the Newcastle Youth Studies Centre for a number of years and just recently moved to Deakin. And to continue on, we're going to look at Dave's specific research that he's done over the past nearly half a decade, really, maybe a little bit more, about young people and workers and their orientation to it. But to kind of situate it, moving on from what Josh was just telling us about the new world of work, and relating this back to youth transitions that we've been talking in the course somewhat. Precarity has been a kind of new way of thinking about the world of work. Some people call it as class, some people kind of think of it more as a kind of structure of feeling, but it relates much to the stuff that I've been going on about in the course quite a bit already about that extended transitions, the way that kind of that youth period from being a child to becoming an adult, those markers of adulthood are kind of moving later. In the school to work transition, which we're focusing upon in this week, getting a full-time job is happening later and later if it's at all possible. There's upward credentializing of the labour market. People are studying more and studying for a while, getting a job, going back and forth. So there's been a bunch of fairly recent social changes that are driven by economic changes that Dave's work, I think, is particularly adept in helping us understand, what's going on there and how young people have to deal with those problems and navigate this transition and navigate the labour market. So thanks for joining us, Dave. Can you tell us firstly a little bit about yourself, what your research is about and what kind of research you're up to at the moment?
Sure. Thanks, Steve. Yeah, so I am a senior lecturer in the School of Education at Deakin University. And since about 2016, I've been looking at the relationship between young people and work in a kind of range of different contexts. And one of the things that I've come to kind of focus on is what I've called the formation of young people as workers. And basically what that means is that, excuse me, we sort of take for granted that everybody just is a worker. It's almost, there's just an assumption that we are workers, especially young people who are basically regarded as future workers a lot of the time, or approached as workers now. But what I think we need to focus on is that actually young people become workers through a series of processes that connect with the demands that work places upon them. And I think it's really useful to look at how that actually happens. So that would be basically what my general work has kind of looked at in a whole range of different areas.
Yeah, and it's an interesting kind of distinction to make. So much of the value of the way humans are kind of judged is about, their productivity and their work, the kind of identity around that as well. It's much of the energy put into young people's lives from that child to youth to adult period seems to be about making them a productive worker. And there's kind of a bunch of human capital, I suppose, orientations towards young people there. Why do you think it's important to look at those processes in detail to kind of think about how it affects young people's lives, but also what it means about work?
Yeah, good question. So, well, for the first part of your question, as you say, there's a massive social apparatus which actually is increasingly extending into early childhood now, which is focused on making young people productive. And as a result of the kind of precariousness as well that you've sort of talked about earlier, young people are under pressure to devote an enormous part of their life and an enormous part of themselves into the process of figuring out what am I going to do in terms of work. And what that means is figuring out how can I become a productive subject within the contemporary labour market. So it speaks to an enormously important aspect of what it means to be a young person now. And then what it tells us about work is it actually gives us a new perspective on the way that value is created and on the way that the labour process operates. So there's kind of an assumption that, work consists of, I've got a series of qualifications and I go to work and I sell those to my employer for a period of time, and that's kind of work. But what a focus on the formation of young people as workers teaches us really is that youth itself is something that's forged in the dynamics of work. So youth itself, I would argue, is not something that in a sense just pre-exists the labour market. but actually the demands of work, both becoming productive and actually the demands of labor in different industries, shape youth itself in a really fundamental way. So we get to see a new kind of intersection of the relationship between identity and work as well.
Yeah. And you use the kind of idea of valorization to kind of think about this. Can you just kind of tell us a little bit about what that means?
Sure, sure. So basically, the valorization, it means the attribution of value to something in one sense or another. The key thing to think about, key thing when it comes to value, right? We are used to, in our day-to-day life, thinking of the value of something as its price, right? This is what this thing costs. But actually, if you think about value in a broader sense, we're also constantly making judgments about whether or not something is actually worth what it costs. You see what I mean? So value is not the same as the price of something, although it's assigned a price. Value is a set actually of shifting relationships between ourselves, one another, the commodities that we buy and sell, and the frameworks that we bring to the world to make sense of it in order to decide what something is worth.
Yep.
And what I have sort of tried to do in my work is to show that the presence of young people in particular industries often actually creates value because they are so associated with experiences and characteristics that connect with the way that the industry works, that the industry is in a sense trying to sell others. And so, yeah, and so the nature of a worker shapes whether or not the thing that's being produced is regarded as valuable,
Yep.
really.
So throughout the course already, we've heard about the kind of new forms of labor and immaterial labor, effective labor, emotional labor. I think I've got a slide on it here somewhere, but like those kind of things and effective labor. And one of the things in your work that I think is really valuable is this idea of how youthfulness itself becomes something that's valuable to these industries that you're kind of touching upon. So can you kind of expand on that a little bit for us?
Yeah, sure, sure. So basically, what I've tried to argue is that we are in a situation in which, if you look at a range of different economic contexts, youthfulness is attributing value to things. Okay, so let me unpack that. What do I mean, first of all, by youthfulness? We think of young people as intrinsically youthful, right? But if you think about in a whole range of different ways, youthfulness is actually something that is bought and sold. So youth is something that's popularly associated with a range of things. For instance, spontaneous enjoyment. Young people are regarded as just kind of like fun in a kind of frivolous and pleasurable way. Youth is also associated with kind of up-to-date or cutting-edge consumption, right? So, it's young people that are regarded as tastemakers in a whole range of different areas. And what we can do is if we actually kind of trace the way that this works in particular industrial contexts, we can see youthfulness being really deliberately mobilized to confer value on things, including consumer goods and including also service interactions and workers themselves. So I'll give you a sort of an example of this, if you like. So if you think about, for example, the way that the kind of fashion retail industry operates, okay? So analyses of the kind of world of high fashion has shown that fashion designers will often look at youth subcultures for new ideas, right? So these are just young people hanging out, dressing in particular ways, making music in particular ways, but these become sources of inspiration for the fashion industry, in which relatively young designers are within the industry positioned as the people who really know what's going on, kind of in a cutting edge way. That then filters down into the kind of retail industry, right? Which kind of picks up these trends and packages them up in a more kind of consumer friendly way than your $9 million size 2 kind of high fashion dress. Okay. And then who sells them? Young workers sell them, right?
Yeah.
Young workers sell them because they're regarded as having the right kind of youthful look and the right youthful relational style to sell these products. So in that whole system, we've got a situation in which youthfulness, because it's regarded as something that's fun and culturally up to date, is being mobilized throughout the industry to make a commodity
Yep.
valuable.
Yep. That's a good example, I think. So that's the kind of broader conceptual terrain that you've situated the work in. And then your research has kind of looked at the ways that young people engage with the labour market, think about themselves in relation to it, and the different kind of ways that what you refer to as kind of self-realization within those processes. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, yeah. So basically what I've tried to argue in some of my work, and what I really what I discovered actually doing the research that you've kind of described, is that young people nowadays are encouraged to see work as having a massive significance way beyond the economic reward of working for money. What I found talking to young people from kind of year 12 all the way through to people in their kind of late 20s is that in very different ways, depending on their social background, young people regarded work as an arena not just of economic reward, but actually of the realization of the self. So what mattered was not simply being employed and getting paid, although obviously that matters a lot, but actually what really mattered was having the right job for me, the job that would allow me to realize aspects of myself. So work was regarded as a space where I could sort of self-actualize or self-realize or go on a process of personal self-development through working.
Yep.
And what that means is kind of what I was saying before, in which people are encouraged to really invest themselves a lot in work. What we're seeing is the notion of self-realization, which is a big thing right now, the whole self-help industry, be your best self, things like that. That notion of self-realization is starting to become wrapped up with the dynamics of work. And that is a really profound shift, because what it means is that our identities are embedded within and connected with the economy in a really profound, a very intimate way, in terms of the most personal aspirations for ourselves that we have, to
Yeah.
kind of be our best selves. Yeah.
So how do you think that, like, I think a way to maybe illustrate more of that more is to think, how does that compare to previous generations?
Yeah, that's a good idea. That's a good idea. That's a good question. So there's some historical work on this, um, and we can look at it in terms of the old kind of sociological idea of the work ethic. Okay, so I'll give you a really quick potted history. Hopefully, this isn't too long.
Yep.
So, work ethic stage number one. Okay, when capitalism first emerged, capitalists had a problem, which is that nobody wanted to work beyond what was required for their material subsistence. Okay. They were faced with the problem of converting a peasant class into an industrial working class. Now, the solution was what Max Weber called the Protestant work ethic. And the Protestant work ethic was saying to workers, work hard, succeed, and you will be rewarded by going to heaven when you die. Okay. So
Yep.
that's the reward beyond the material,
Yep.
beyond the paycheck, right?
Delayed
Then,
gratification.
yeah, then there we in the industrial era we have the second work ethic, and that was work hard and you will get to consume. Okay, we'll give you a good paycheck, you'll experience social mobility, and you'll get to consume. That's the reward of work. Now, in the contemporary world, what we have is what we can think of as the contemporary work ethic, which is work hard and you will be self-realized. You will be
Yeah.
self-actualized. So the reward for work has gone from a spiritual reward, you'll go to heaven, to a material reward, you'll be able to consume, to a kind of something much more personal, where it's the self in general that's at stake
Yeah.
here when it comes to work.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting that that kind of definition of the rewards of work is happening at a time where the monetary rewards are being lessened or threatened or casualized and precaritized, right? So
Mm.
if we want to talk about what capitalism needs here for us to invest in this kind of stuff, it has to kind of relate to like how we think about ourselves, because the wages of late capitalism are moving to the point now where it actually is not providing subsistence for a large population, right?
Mm. Yeah, that's right. I mean, if you look at popular culture, it's all about rise and grind. You know
Yeah, rise and
what I
grind and
mean?
hustle.
And I think that
Hustle.
rise and grind kind of hustle culture is really connected with all of this stuff. Yeah.
So to finish off this section, we've got a couple of quotes here just to talk about. So what is this kind of first one here in terms relating to the cultivation of the self? What do you think? This is kind of
Yeah.
from
Okay.
your projects and a young person talking about their
Mm.
orientation towards work.
Yep. So basically, this is a young woman that I interviewed when she was in year 12. And I was asking her sort of, what do you think is the main thing that determines your success, and how is it that you are going to decide what you want to do with your working life? Of course, this is a question that year 12s are being asked all the time, right? So what she basically said was that what mattered in terms of success was to be passionate,
Yep.
right? And that if you are passionate, then as long as you apply yourself to something that you're passionate about, you'll succeed,
Yep.
right? And what will actually happen is that your success won't just be limited to your job, right? What matters is that you're passionate. And then in that sense, as long as you're doing things that you're passionate about, you'll be okay. And she sort of regarded her job as a place to realize her passions in a really expansive sense, right? So her job was an arena where, again, that kind of self-realization thing that I was talking about, but also that passion was something that wasn't just specific to work, it was life in general. And in that sense, the distinction between work and the rest of her life was kind of hazy. It was kind of like work was life and life was work.
Yeah. And to kind of oversimplify again, relating to those epochal shifts, the kind of um, the kind of things that you might want to invest yourself in the past might have been like things you would spend money on from work. There's a
Mm,
kind of that's still definitely the case. Consumer culture is obviously still a big thing, and we still do that.
of course,
The
yeah.
change here is kind of there's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy of just investing yourself in your work. You will therefore be happy.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. So if you think about those work ethic things, the idea of the industrial work ethic basically said to workers, look, we know work sucks a bit, but if you work hard, you will pay you well. And then when you
Yeah.
leave work, you can have a good life, right? You can go on holiday and all of those things. The idea with the contemporary work ethic and this idea of passion is that work is, in a sense, its own reward, you
Yeah.
know?
And so what that means though, and we'll get into this more detail in the next part though, is that like if you're struggling to get work or you're struggling to get the job you want and you're investing your whole self in it and you're doing kind of self-definitional things around that investment, it can be really kind of damaging to you if it's not going well, right?
That's right. That's right. So yeah, this is a quote from a young woman who, when I interviewed her, she was. This is from, I believe, the second time I interviewed her. And anyway, she had been through a long, long, long period of unemployment. And but basically, she says in this quote, when I started out, I was sort of like the young woman in the previous quote, where I really want something that I can kind of, stick with for a long time and kind of, and then time goes on, you get desperate, and then time goes even more on, and you think, well, what's wrong with me? That I'm unable to
Yeah.
kind of be employed. And I think what that speaks to is the way that, I mean, we know that work is an arena of self-realization. And so this is what happens when you don't have access to arguably the most critical and culturally kind of celebrated
Yeah.
arena of self-realization. And yeah, there was very significant impact on this young woman's well-being in a whole series of ways. So I think what that speaks to is, the kind of underside of the work ethic and the underside of this idea that we should be self-realizing through
Yeah.
work. Yeah.
And I think from memory, like there's people, a few people like this in your research. Some of them were doing all the right things. They were retraining, doing all the courses, all that kind of stuff. But
Oh,
like, what disappears out of these explanations, right, is the fact that the labor market hasn't got enough jobs, hasn't got enough full-time work. So it's going to
yeah.
spit people out to the kind of pointy end of it, regardless of
Yeah.
your choices and the things that you do. So ideologically speaking, it relates a lot to that kind of previous um, conceptual analysis around individualization, that the self is blamed for more structural things, and it kind of then almost pathologizes the negative suffering that people then have because of the fact that they're kind of spat out of the labor market.
Yeah, no, 100%. I completely agree. And I mean, what it also speaks to is the fact that, becoming productive is now a massive part of being unemployed.
Yeah,
So unemployment is actually, unemployed people are not unengaged. Like, they are constantly doing things, both because they're required to and also because they're personally desperate to try to enhance their productivity and their employability. And those things are increasingly expansive. Everything from retraining programs all the way through to, I had one participant who was doing things like public speaking programs to try to increase her confidence, to work on her. She was afraid that she didn't make the right kind of eye contact with people in and it was about her entire personal comportment, the way she
Yep.
carried herself and spoke. She saw all of these things as deficient and as things to work on in order to hopefully get a job. So the requirements of productivity are getting more expansive and are also getting beyond the bounds of work, actually.
Yep.
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, we'll leave this section here and come back and talk about some other aspects of your research in a sec.
Okay, thanks.